Well, welcome along to what is kind of a bonus episode of Rugby Unwrapped. Scotty Stevenson with you, Simon Porter, CEO of Halo Sport, and we're joined by Tony Lewis and Mike Rogers. Tony is the CEO of Tasman Rugby, Mike, the CEO of Bay of Plenty Rugby, and thank you first and foremost, gentlemen, for giving us the opportunity to have you on board and front-footing this. We wanted to really cover off today the provincial side of New Zealand's rugby story. We've heard from a lot of the leaders at New Zealand Rugby, board members. We've heard from the players, and now to the guys on the coalface. Tony, first of all, congratulations to you and your union, reigning Premier champions. So you started the season probably optimistically, and everything's come to a sudden screeching halt. How do you stand right now as a union?
As a provincial union, we're in a fortunate position. Over the last 6 years, we've been able to squirrel a decent reserves away. So we've had a reserves policy, and we've followed that pretty much very carefully for 6 years. So we have got enough for us to survive. It's sort of 6 months of fixed costs. So I think we could probably delve into this year a bit and a bit of next. But it doesn't mean we're not feeling the pain. We've had a reduction in staff salaries by 20%. We've removed 40% from the salary lines. And we're looking at actually what rugby looks like in the future in the community space. We'll be governed by the decisions New Zealand Rugby Union make. We certainly don't want to move staff on if they've moved staff on in their place in that particular role. So it's a bit of a wait and see.
What about for you, Mike? Is your situation as rosy or as rosy as it can be right now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar, Scotty. Similar approach to what Tasman have done so well down in their region. We were pretty motivated to ensure that we had the future of the union well secured, and we've worked pretty hard to ensure we've got cash reserves as well. And if you look at the history of Bay of Plenty, it's pretty checkered, and there's been a lot of ups and downs, and we've certainly been in financial strife a number of times. So worked hard to make sure that didn't happen again. I don't think anyone could have predicted the impact of COVID on sport and the wider community. But yeah, it's going to be tough. It was same situation in terms of working through with staff and resource and focusing on what the future of the game is going to look like, because I think that's the hardest question to answer. While we might be able to work our way through the next 6 months and through the end of the year, is how do we prepare for what the future of rugby is going to need to throw at us.
Before we move too quickly into the future, let's talk about the past and what are our provincial unions in the makeup of New Zealand Rugby. It's widely known that you guys are the constituent members of New Zealand Rugby, the incorporated society. So I guess, Tony, where do you see the provincial unions in this picture? We know that funding's under threat, but where do you see the unions in terms of their importance to rugby in this country?
Yeah, I might have a different view than quite a few of my colleagues, whether super or PUs, but I believe everything is an integrated part of rugby, and we're one of the key integrated parts between club and super. So I see that we're all in this sort of journey. I hate that word. John Mitchell started it, so I'll probably carry it on. But at the moment, in this sort of idea of trying to work out where everyone fits, if we suffer from illusions of grandeur and think one part of the jigsaw is more important than the other, I have a gut feeling that everything will fall over. So I think provincial unions are key for the aspirational path of every boy or girl playing rugby from JB to age group, and the academies serve that, and senior rugby serves that to produce Mitre 10, that produce super players that hopefully then produce All Blacks. So very key integrated part, and we enjoy being part of that process, and it's been very successful over a long period of time.
Mike, do you feel similarly? Because I think from an outsider looking in, sometimes it's hard to understand all of the roles. You've got to run ostensibly a semi-professional rugby team at competitive level. You've got other representative teams underneath that Mitre 10 Cup level. You've got the clubs, you've got the community game. So where do you and how do you divvy up the resources at your disposal?
Yeah, it is a complex organisation, Scotty, to sort of manage and make sure that we're catering for all those different requirements that you've outlined. I think the first thing is, we see ourselves as an important connector to our community. Rugby has a huge role in engaging with our community. So I think that's the strength of the New Zealand rugby model through the provincial system. We can connect, we can engage and be a big part of the environment right throughout New Zealand. So that's the first and foremost thing for us as a provincial union. What are we doing to ensure that we're connecting to all of our stakeholders, to all of our young people that want to play the game? And I think secondly, as Tony's pointed out so well, we then connect to, I guess, to that performance level of the game, the professional level of the game, and ensuring that there is opportunities for any young player right throughout New Zealand. If they're motivated and aspirational, there is a system for them to follow so they can get to that top of the game. And look, you can't even look any further than our new All Black captain Sam Cane as a classic example of that model at its best. A young fella coming out of Reparoa, moving into Tauranga to further his rugby career, and now he's an All Black captain. So I guess the question would be, if we don't have that integrated model that Tony's talking about, and we don't make sure we've got an approach that cares for the whole game, what would happen to people like Sam Cane?
He'd go to St Kitts.
Possibly. Would he go on to be All Blacks captain? That would be the question.
I'm surprised it took you 5 minutes to mention the new All Black captains from Bay of Plenty, Mike. I thought you would have just want to make sure that was a public service announcement out there first.
I was actually waiting for you, Si, to actually put it out there that Bay of Plenty's got 3 of the 4 captains of our national teams. But look, if you want to talk about that, we certainly can divert to that space if you want.
I forgive the silliness, Mike, but I mean, in the serious side of this business, we know that you receive funds from New Zealand Rugby. As the members of New Zealand Rugby, you have to go and fundraise yourselves as well. You have to deal with your own sponsors. You have a wage bill to pay your players at Mitre 10 Cup level. And all of those funding streams at the moment, we are certain, are coming under significant threat. So, at this stage, we've seen New Zealand Rugby make cuts. We know that they've cut funding to the unions. At what point do those really hard decisions need to be made about where you are going to focus the monies at your disposal?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that we challenge ourselves all the time in terms of the balanced approach to how we fund our game and where we invest our funds. And so it's not because of COVID and in this situation. It's always a challenge for provincial unions to secure enough funding to do what we want to do in our community and provide those pathways and opportunities for aspirational players and coaches, etc. alike. So I think the first thing in terms of that, provincial unions are going to need to be creative and looking at other ways of funding our game. And so that's the first and foremost thing. We know we've got some traditional revenue streams that are under pressure. So I think we need to take some responsibility to look at how we diversify our income streams. But equally, I think we have a responsibility as provincial unions to talk to our key funding partners, be it New Zealand Rugby or trust funding or our commercial relationships, so they understand the story around why it's so important to invest in this level of the game. And that's our job, is to really convince people that their money is going into an environment that's getting great success. And I think, for the majority of our provincial unions, we can hold our head up high and say that we're doing some fantastic work in our community. So that's our job over the next period, is to ensure that we do our best to secure the funds for our community.
Well, we've got a Mitre 10 Cup perspective, and it's a great pleasure to welcome, for a Heartland perspective, to our chat today, Cushla Tangaere-Manuel, who's the CEO of Ngāti Porou East Coast and also a new appointee to the New Zealand Māori Rugby Board. I believe you're there, Cush. How's things going in the world of Heartland and the world of Ngāti Porou?
Well, finally getting the announcement, it has taken us by surprise, to be honest. We were all not expecting to be able to play rugby until level 1. So for that announcement to be made, we're sort of chasing our tails at the moment. You know what coasties are like. I know everyone's going to say we're good to go, but really working through the restrictions and what the requirements are going to be for our clubs will be the issue. But having said that, our people really handled level 4 really well and managed to be case-free in Tairāwhiti, on the East Coast. But, we can't take that for granted.
That's the power of roadblocks, Cush.
That's a whole other show there, Scotty.
Hey, Kush, we've heard from Tony and Mike today, and just them outlining what they believe some of their roles and pressures are around the Mitre 10 Cup provincial unions. What about the Heartland? You guys made the decision very early in the piece to put Heartland Championship aside this season to reduce some costs, to reduce some pressure in the system. Where do you see yourselves now for the rest of the year in terms of your responsibilities to your community and to the game?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, we appreciate the different pressures that the Mitre 10 unions are under with their players, etc. Us being amateur, we didn't have to have that consideration. But it was really helpful that we set our priorities early in the piece, and they were simple. Number one, our people. Number two, our clubs, and then any representative rugby. And NZR sort of took the pressure off us in terms of teenage rugby by making that call for us. But at the end of the day, just, looking at common sense things like our budgets, we simply couldn't exist potentially next year if we went ahead with Heartland. So we're still looking at doing like local derbies, etc., because our people still have the appetite for representative rugby. But our priority now is clubs and our communities. And, you've seen the impact that rugby has around here. To quote Bailey, who I'm very proud of, who's been appointed to the New Zealand Rugby Board, rugby's a religion and church starts at 2:30 on Saturday. So everyone's keen to get back to church.
Simon, I want to bring you in here because I know that your contracting model doesn't spread or doesn't go as far as Heartland, because as Cushla points out, these are amateur players. But obviously it's a talent pool for you as an agency to look around Heartland Championship, and you yourself played in the Heartland Championship as a staunch first five, if I recall rightly, Ports, for the old goal. But
nothing staunch or talented about what I was doing, I can assure you, Scotty. But I think, it touches a bit on what we talked about in episode 1 around, there's still, I suppose from a talent pool point of view, the reality is if you want to be a professional player now, it is about trying to migrate up to, if you are in a Heartland union, it is trying to migrate up to one of the provincial Mitre 10 Cup unions academy systems. And so, as many people as can remain in their areas at school and try to still get good coaching and be, produced out of that area, the better, I suppose. And Orepiro College, Sam Caney did finish off at Tauranga Boys, and there's plenty of examples like that, but, he still identifies very strongly with that area, and there's plenty of examples of people that are playing professionally. Think of the King Country, they're a proud union that's produced a lot of players that kick on to other areas. It's just the nature of the beast, I suppose. And it's just maintaining as much rugby as we can in those areas to make sure as many people have the opportunity to play.
Tony, your province in particular, Tasman, has been a great beneficiary of some Heartland players. I think the likes of Marty Banks and others who have come through the Buller program and then have represented the union, and other guys who came through Marlborough and Nelson Bays at the formation of Tasman. So do you still see that as an important pathway, as an important club and player pathway for provincial rugby?
Yeah, I see it two ways. We have a number of club players who go down and play for Buller and West Coast as well, and their aspiration is they want to be a Marco player, but they're probably just not quite good enough, and that's their next level. A bit like the first I've out of Otago University, Porter, having to go up and play for the old Golds. So we see that as critically important. In the same breath, a number of those players will come up here. So I think Billy Guyton, who I saw this morning, he's a classic, and obviously the world's most loved player, Marty Banks, infamously come out of a Buller mine to play and do well for a number of super franchises.
I want to talk, Mike, we've got Cushla on the line, and it's always a great privilege to catch up. By the way, Cush, congratulations on your appointment to the Māori Rugby Board as well. We don't want that to go unnoticed. But, Mike, what is the provincial unions' relationship to the Heartland? The Mitre 10 Cup unions and the Heartland unions, is the relationship strong, considering there's 26 provinces in this country and you've all got a say around the table in one way, shape or form?
Yeah, I think it is pretty strong, Scotty, over the breadth of New Zealand. Like Tony's pointed out, there's a good relationship where players can flow both ways, and we have our own example in a guy like Aaron Carroll, who wasn't quite ready for Mitre 10 Cup, went and played for the Swamp Foxes, came back and made Mitre 10 Cup with us, and then got a contract to play Super Rugby. So I think that's a really good example of how that model does work really well. even off the field, there's some really good communication between the Mitre 10 Cup provincial unions and Heartland unions, because there are still a lot of similarities, even though size of unions may be different. There's a range of things that we can talk to each other about and how we can work together, collaboratively, even in situations where we need to make sure New Zealand Rugby understands the position of provincial unions. I think the collaboration across the board is really useful. So I think the relationship's really strong. We love our relationship with our neighbours, and we're always looking for opportunities to work together.
And they're very good socially too, Scotty.
I can vouch for that.
Lead the way.
That should be a championship.
I ask in the sense that over the last 4 years in particular, the board makeup of New Zealand Rugby has changed dramatically. That was first mooted in 2017. Gone now are our traditional models of representation, which were zones or regions where unions would all have to get together, come up with a nominee, and that nominee would be appointed to the board. That's all shifted now. So there seems to be a very big move away from the regionalisation of New Zealand Rugby to the centralisation of New Zealand Rugby. And has that in any way undermined the collaboration between the unions or weakened the bonds that were once there for unions in each region in the country?
I can probably talk to this, the fact that we nominated Michael Jones. So I think it's the provincial unions have got more consistent in their voice, and the fact that they are putting people forward who are going to support the provincial unions, who understand provincial union rugby well, and will also look back and make sure that this group that's critically important to the growth of the game is their voice is heard. So I think the best people are getting on the New Zealand Rugby Union board, and the PUs are working really, really hard to ensure that happens.
And I think Bailey's another good example of that. Having someone out of a heartland area was well supported in terms of the Mitre 10 Cup, from my understanding. Again, best person for the job, who understood the game of rugby right from under fives all the way through. So I think that's just another example of the collaboration across Mitre 10 and Heartland unions to try and do the right thing by the game in our communities.
Yeah, and with Bailey, like for Heartland unions, I mean, you'll know how the voting system works. Typically we get about 2 votes each. So what we've learned over the last 3 to 5 years is that our strength is in our collective. So we really have to move together, and that's how we've been getting heard at NZR level. So we made a conscious decision, as much as we could, to block vote, because if 50% of us go one way, then we basically had 0 vote. So, I mean, he had to work really hard. Everyone had to work hard, but it was really gratifying for us to be able to go in as a collective and know that we stood with one voice.
One of the wee picadillos in the constitution of New Zealand Rugby is that the votes each union get are directly attributable to the number of teams that are signed up in their region, the number of registered teams. COVID is going to have a massive impact on team registrations in each of your unions. Has anyone thought about the ramifications of a loss in registration in terms of the number of votes around the NZR table?
I'm not sure if it's common knowledge, but we've already settled, for want of a better word, on our funding model for this year. And what we're hoping for is next year that's going to be based on potentially last year's registrations, because there's just no telling what's going to happen. And I mean, we've already been told by Mark Robinson that the landscape is going to change. We're not going back to business as usual. So it's all we're reimagining rugby at the moment.
You feel like, Mike, you're also reimagining rugby? I mean, you have reimagined rugby in some ways already with your involvement with Global Rapid Rugby, Bay of Plenty's involvement. And just before we get back to the point Cushla made, how has that worked out? And is that something that before COVID you saw a decent future in?
Yeah, if I just answer your last question around the representation, it's a really interesting model, which I don't think you'd find in too many organisations. But having senior teams as your benchmark for how you vote, if you look at us, for an example, we've got over 12,500 players and third biggest union in the country, but majority of our players are actually secondary school and junior, and they're not really represented in terms of that structure. So it's probably something that will need to be considered into the future around how we ensure that the best representation model is in place. But in terms of the Rapid Rugby experience, look, it was fantastic. Even though very short-lived, we played the one game and were able to scrape a win for the China Lions over in Fiji, which is no mean feat. But the whole concept for us was about providing new opportunities for our players, for our coaches. We saw a need in our environment to do that, and that's part of our responsibility. We want to be able to look in the future to do the same for our female game, and I guess concern for us is the ongoing pressure that's being placed on the Mitre 10 Cup in terms of its role and its responsibility and importance to the game. And so for us in Bay of Plenty, that's a concerning position. We think it's a really important part of the future of our game. But equally, if that's the message that we're getting, that is not going to be played at the same level into the future, we need alternatives for our players and coaches. So, it was a great experience. Hopefully that opportunity continues into the future, Scotty, because I think it's going to be part of the new normal for us.
It's an interesting point you raised, that we're not going to see business as usual. I think the appetite's there, Tony, for a Mitre 10 Cup, but heretofore that's been 14 teams, and it's an expensive endeavour. I don't know what the figures are or whether you can divulge them, but it would be a significant portion of your annual revenues that go to funding the team and funding participation in that competition. Yeah,
look, it's very important. The Mitre 10 Cup is a very important revenue stream for us to fund community rugby. If we didn't have a Mitre 10 Cup, our revenue to invest in the community rugby would be significantly impacted. And that just goes through the fact that you might employ your Mitre 10 Cup coaches, but they are working really, really hard in that community, First 15, Premier Rugby, your analyst is across both community, schools, etc. So, and that's the revenue you earn commercially. So we've correlated, basically there's 2 staff appointments that are funded by the Mako success or revenue brought in within the organisation. So we see Mitre 10 Cup rugby as critical to any success that we have in the community game. And as I said before, it's an integrated game, and you take one piece of the jigsaw out and it crashes down pretty quickly. I'm sure that everyone in New Zealand rugby sort of understands that.
So, Tony, mate, in terms of, like, I've heard, you and Mike and, both of your unions are pretty strong and innovative and done pretty well over the last few years without wanting to blow wind up either of you. But, I mean, and so, what I've heard has been pretty positive today. But is that the general feeling across all the provincial unions? Does everyone feel the same about the Mitre 10 Cup this year and getting across the start line? Like, I know you're here to talk about your own individual unions, but I'm sure you are talking as a group and as a collective.
I'll say something, then Mike can say something as well. We haven't even thought about this together, but the one thing I'd say is that there's 14 provincial unions all on the same page. There's 14 provincial unions that all want to play in the Mitre 10 Cup. And there's 14 provincial unions working really, really hard with New Zealand Rugby and Rob Nichol to get to the start line. Like everything in life, it was only, and I'm very careful in our position, it was only a few years ago that we were last in everything. So we wouldn't be standing here and gloating, because next year it could be us, So we've got 14 provincial unions who want to play in the Mitre 10 Cup, and 14 provincial unions all working hard to ensure that happens.
And what about... Sorry, mate, to interject, but what about, does that same apply to the Wharapama Cup? The unions all committed to wanting to get that off the ground and run that in parallel at the same time?
I'll answer that. So for us, the Wharapama Cup is equally as important as the Mitre 10 Cup, and we've made no secret of our investment in the female game and the importance of the female game from a Bay of Plenty's point of view. And I know it's not out there publicly and there's some frustration with that, but there is some really good work going on behind the scenes in terms of ensuring that there's opportunities for our female players as well. I think, from a New Zealand rugby point of view, given the huge impact on their revenue, getting the Mitre 10 Cup and Super Rugby obviously up and running are priorities, because it does generate the revenue at this point of time. And that's hopefully going to mean that we can fund other competitions, including the Wharapama Cup. But, from a provincial union point of view, I think there's a real eagerness to have the Wharapama Cup up in some shape or form this year, to ensure that we can provide those opportunities for our female players.
I totally agree.
Yeah, the big question for all of you is, can you afford it?
I think the game, the Mitre 10 Cup is a big investment, and I know Tony's absolutely right. In all the conversations we've had with our counterparts, all 14 unions want to be involved in that level of the game, but we've also got to recognise the game is under incredible pressure, and so I think it's going to be something we're going to have to continually look at. How do we do it? How do we do it well? What is its role? And how do people make sure that they're a viable organisation to compete in that competition? Because I think first and foremost, all of us will acknowledge that our community is the most important part of our remit as a provincial union. We need to make sure that we never jeopardise our ability to deliver to our community. Now, for a number of provincial unions, like Tony has said, the Mitre 10 Cup or the semi-professional, professional game funds the community game. So from a Bay of Plenty point of view, that's absolutely critical for us to have that level of game to help us fund our community and make sure we can do what we can. But there's others who are in a different situation. So it will be, I think, a pretty tough time over the next sort of 18 months, 2 years, as we continue to look at what the future looks like.
I guess the big thing too, Simon, from your point of view, is, as Rob Nichol pointed out in episode 1, we've got 420 professional rugby players currently playing in competitions around the world. The Mitre 10 Cup employs a lot of people, albeit on a semi-professional basis. But that's a lot of jobs and a lot of players that suddenly, if they can't play Mitre 10 Cup, might be looking for roles elsewhere in a time when the world's market is contracting, not expanding. So do we risk not just losing people to the game here, but losing people to the game full stop if we cannot find ways to fund this kind of competition in our own backyard?
Well, yeah, I suppose we will. But then again, if it's not sustainable and there's not the money in the game, and if there aren't the jobs overseas or the experiences and money overseas isn't worthwhile anymore, then you will see players wanting to come back and play back in New Zealand. What that might look like and what does that mean? Does that mean that there's less opportunity for the young guys coming through because guys want to hang around for a bit longer? I don't know. I haven't really thought it through yet. But yeah, when you say there's lots of people playing rugby overseas, there's a lot of people sitting not playing rugby overseas at the moment. It's probably a little bit more accurate, wanting to play and going crazy in isolation. But it will be really interesting on the player market as to the psyche of the player moving forward. If there are continued travel restrictions over the next few years, or if people have got young kids or whatever, it's going to be really interesting to see if there is a shift in mentality and people aren't so keen to go, or people do want to stay in New Zealand for longer or even return.
Ports, it's also, I think, important that what the competition can afford to pay players needs to be factored in. You can't expect anyone to work in an industry or a sector where they're not getting paid fairly for what they're doing. So it's a real balancing act, isn't it? We do need to consider the cost and the viability, but at the same time, it's like anything. If you want a good product, you've got to pay a reasonable amount for a good product. So that's the challenge for us, I think, at the provincial union level, is ensuring that we do have a good product for our players and make sure we fairly remunerate them.
Yeah, because I think... sorry, you go. Oh, well, Tony, I'll just say that's what I kind of meant about the sustainability question. If we can't continue to pay people to play the game at the level, pay them enough that they are prepared to sacrifice careers or education or whatever, then, people just won't play. And I guess that's the biggest issue with Mitre 10 Cup is, as salaries have trended down over the last few years, that, are people going to want to continue to do it if they are semi-professional? And we all know that it's not supposed to be their primary source of income, is what it says in the collective, etc. At what point does it just become too much of a hassle to get 4 months off work, or can they actually make it work by just the income they're going to receive for that 4 months and doing a bit of odd job everywhere else? That's the really difficult bit as we look into the future, as to the time commitment and the reward for playing in this competition.
And that's one of the benefits, Scotty, that we saw out of Rapid Rugby, is we could provide players in New Zealand the opportunity to have 2 incomes from rugby, and they could operate in a professional environment or a semi-professional environment for near on 12 months of the year and prepare them for Super Rugby, or whether they went to Europe or Japan. that was the motivation. So it was great to be able to pick up some players from Southland and Waikato and North Harbour and give them an opportunity to play rugby versus having to go back on the tools. So, yeah, it's maybe something as provincial unions we need to consider more. How do we do that?
Kush, what motivates people to play club rugby in Ngāti Porou East Coast country? Because there is no money at the end of it for representative jerseys. They're not doing it for cash, but yet every year you're fielding a team in the heartland, have done until this year. What's the motivation for your players in your community?
Well, that's funny. Listening to these guys speak, I'm thinking that's the dilemma. You don't realise until you're in rugby how much goes on in the background, and that rugby is business. Whereas, the guys here, they just want to get on the field and play. And I was thinking about, worst case scenario, say we lose all the support from New Zealand rugby, because we don't know what's going to happen once, they make the announcement about staff cuts, etc. That'll probably give us an indication of what the future might look like, what they're prioritising. So with that in mind, I thought, our clubs could probably survive without us, without New Zealand rugby, because they just want to play rugby. And so we're lucky, talking about relationships with Mitre 10 unions, we're so far removed geographically, it's real effort to keep connected. So luckily the brand is still strong enough that people still want to come home and wear the sky blue and play for their iwi. So we're lucky in that effect, being the only iwi-based team in the world. Like you've discussed, we're amateur, so we can't pay people per se. A couple of our players drove them off their own backs last year, one from Palmerston North, and I don't know if anyone's driven to Rotorua from Palmerston North, but that's quite an effort every weekend to get back and play. So
I reckon it's the feed. It's got to be the motivation,
best place
right?
to play rugby. Best place to play rugby.
Number one.
The crayfish.
Mate, you don't have to pay players. You put a feed on like that, like you'll get anyone.
So I think Southland should do the same with oysters.
The difference when you live around Tairāwhiti, though, is that's nothing unusual, that feed. It's only for the out-of-towners where it looks like a bonus. So,
I presume things have changed a little bit, though. When I had a game there and I went into the club rooms afterwards and I asked for a Coke or a Powerade or something, they looked at me funny. I said, I just want a non-alcoholic drink, and they gave me one of those they literally gave me one of those crocs. I said, go help yourself in the kitchen. All right, I'll get a style lager on the way out then. Thanks.
I do want to, you bring up some interesting points, Kush, because you are going to see what the priorities are for New Zealand rugby going forward. As an outsider looking in, we know that there is a constant tension between where they feel they need to step in a community side of their game and the high performance and commercial side of their game. Do you, as a group, Tony, Mike, Kush, feel like a lot more of the community workload is going to be pushed back down into the provinces rather than the centralised model that currently exists?
I think we've been doing the work anyway, to be honest. I think the role of New Zealand Rugby is to give us direction, programs, and then it's been the people on the ground that's delivered them. So I don't see a dramatic change. What I suppose would be the interesting part would be the professional development that New Zealand Rugby's offered to our staff. That will probably cease to exist because those staff members might not be there. So I'd like to think that we will still deliver outstanding programs at the provincial level and probably just not receive as much guidance. But one thing has shown me in this Zoom conferencing world that there's nothing stopping now the community rugby managers, RDOs, referees, etc., getting together and sharing ideas.
Mike, do you see it similarly?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to be what level of resource we can have in place to support our community game. I like Cushla, think our community game, our people love it so much they'll make it happen. There'll be a way, but how much support we can provide our clubs and our schools to enable them to do it successfully is going to be the question. We don't know yet. But like Tony, I agree, the workload at a provincial level is right through Heartland and Mitre 10 Cup is huge. And the game's growing so quickly with sevens and the growth of the female game, which is amazing, and the growth of Ripper Rugby and new formats. It's just creating more and more work, and then when you overlay that with all the new, health and safety compliance and now COVID measures, it puts a huge amount of pressure on the community game and at a provincial level, because you just got to deliver everything, and it just keeps compounding with less or if you're lucky, retaining the same level of staff. So yeah, we're going to have to change. We're going to have to be innovative and creative, and where it sort of drops, I'm not 100% sure yet.
Definitely agree with you, Mike, in terms of having to deliver more with the same amount of resource and same amount of staff. So, and especially when funding's attached to it, but there's just not the appetite in some of our communities for those. They just want to play 15 sevens and get on with it, Yeah. But we're obliged to deliver these other options that put a burden on our resource.
And I think, Scotty, that's a challenge for the game and how we invest in it. We've obviously seen Super Rugby grow and the professional end of the game grow and the resource going into that side of it grow. However, at the provincial level, if you have a close look, it hasn't grown in terms of resource really across the board. If anything, it's probably retrenched over the last sort of 5 years. So it's trying to, again, go back to that balanced approach of ensuring that the game is invested at all levels, not just at one level, because I think Tony said it quite rightly at the start of this conversation. It's got to be an integrated model. That's been the strength of rugby in New Zealand for so long. And if you ask anyone from any other country, that's been our competitive advantage. So I would hate to see that change to a point where we don't have that integrated model.
Tony, do you see yourself as a competitor to Super Rugby in some ways? Because Super Rugby's obviously been given the green light to return. We know there's private equity floating around in that game that New Zealand Rugby is very keen to appease. You are a stakeholder in the Crusaders, the most successful of all Super Rugby teams here. So what is your relationship as a province to that Super Rugby side? And are you precluded from actually looking to develop a Super Rugby team of your own as Tasman if our competitions become much more localised?
Good question. So we see ourselves as a very much a partnership with Canterbury and ourselves and the Crusaders. So much so, if they do make a loss, we'll be stumping up for it. So from our perspective, is that we work very hard on that partnership and to make sure it goes to the benefit of Tasman, the benefit of our players, etc. Do I see ourselves as a competitor? I don't see the Tasman Rugby Union playing the Mitre 10 Cup as a competitor. I see that we're an essential tool to enable the next generation of young men and the far apart for Whamakama Cup young ladies to go to that next level. So that's what I see our role as. Would we consider a super team option? As you've just pointed out, everything's on the table these days. We looked at the global rapid rugby concept and worked actually with Mike for quite some time, but we just couldn't make it financially work from where we're sitting a fair way away from international airports. So we would look at anything. There's an appetite in the provincial unions to make sure we work much closer with our super, and obviously expect our super to work much closer with us.
Mate, Mike, maybe you'd answer this, but obviously you guys are, you're not host provincial unions to a Super Rugby team. If you were CEO of a Waikato or a Auckland, etc., how about, do you think you'd answer that, or your colleagues would answer that competitor question differently, seeing as you're fishing in the same pond and to some degree?
100% in sponsorship.
Yeah, I think there's certain areas where they are competing, not by probably animosity in that relationship. It's just that there's a limited market, a limited scale in that market, and you've got two teams, one semi-professional, one professional. So yeah, I think in that regard they are competitors, but there's also advantages as well that as you would well know, Ports for a number of years that those central locations have had in terms of player recruitment and other things. So I think there's a balanced approach to that.
The other thing to look at is that the vast majority of super team sponsorship revenues coming out of Auckland. And so I think being in the same area is not as important as or as much as a competition as it was. So if you want to see the amount of time Mike Collins is driving up the motorway, that should give you a fair idea where he's getting his money from.
I thought that's where he's getting some of his players too, Tony. But to be fair,
there's nothing wrong with players coming from St Kitts. We've got quite a few.
To be fair, he would be following behind your car, wouldn't he?
Yeah, it must be a pretty well beaten track down into Hastings at the moment then too, Mike, from Tauranga, is it?
Yeah.
We're part of the Bay, aren't we? It's all big part of that Greater Bay Area ports.
I think he's got an RDO down there, what I hear.
He lives down there, I think, that's right.
Well, look,
She has a
you
name
guys-
with me, actually.
You guys are all fishing in very well populated waters here, but Kush, what about you? Do you feel like you have any connection at all to a Super Rugby side from an East Coast point of view?
Well, obviously we're part of the Hurricanes franchise, so they do really good work with our youth. But from the Super team, not as much as we'd probably like. We have reached out and offered to host the Hurricanes training camp here in Ngāti Porou. But again, everything comes back to budget. But I'm really pleased that the Hurricanes Youth Council are bringing a program to Rotorua this year. You heard it first here. I'm not sure if it's been announced. So that's great. And I mean, it's ironic that we're geographically closer to Bay of Plenty, but we're part of the Hurricanes franchise. So we remain loyal and would like more interaction.
Well, that is interesting. That it's and again, this raises another question. It's the Hurricanes Youth Council that is coming calling. So it's a Super Rugby side that is coming in to do that kind of work in your community. And yet, I think as we've ascertained in this chat, there are some crossovers between what Super Rugby should be representing in the performance and professional pathway and what the unions have traditionally taken care of. So is there room for all players? And does it strike you as weird when a Super Rugby team focuses on youth in your neck of the woods?
Oh, I think it's because, we've actively become more involved in the Hurricanes Youth Council as well. Even though one of my frustrations, and that's one of the things I hope to pursue on the Māori board, is it's really hard for us to be competitive at those competitions. We've got a composite team, under 15s team, because our high schools don't have first 15s anymore because we simply don't have the roles. So it's been really good to get involved at Te Tini Maui level, where not only are we competitive, but we're successful, won both our grades last year. So there's a lot of work to be done. Don't want to move away from the Hurricanes Youth Council, but it's going to come down to whether or not we can continue to invest in competitions that we're not successful in, not even competitive in. Is it good for morale? We're proud to say we have so many representative teams entering these tournaments, but the results aren't very pretty.
Kush, I know we've all got to wrap this up pretty quickly, so I just want to finish with some thoughts from you, if you could. What's the biggest challenge facing Ngāti Porou East Coast and your Heartland colleagues in the next few months?
I think it can be wrapped up in sustainability. Like, what does the future landscape look like and can we survive? I've already said, and I mean, you guys said it too, clubs will make it happen. Communities will make it happen, but what does the future of our unions look like? Trying to be optimistic and excited about the opportunity that we all have now.
Yeah, well, optimism's not going for a price. It's always free, that's for sure. Kush, thanks very much. Mike, what about you? Are you optimistic about what lies ahead for provincial rugby in this country, given its relationship with NZR, the review that's currently in process, the COVID situation to get over, and the rather tenuous grasp still on a Mitre 10 Cup full season?
God, you set the scene well there, Scotty. Thanks.
Sorry, mate.
No, I guess like anything, there's opportunities in situations like this. So that's going to be the thing that we have to get our head around. And as provincial unions, I don't think we've been great historically at really sharing our voice and being out there and proactively communicating what we think our roles and responsibilities are. I think we're always being guilty of waiting for New Zealand rugby or Super Rugby to make the first decisions, and then we react to those decisions. So I think the opportunity is staring us in the face as a collective group, and I mean that as Heartland and Mitre 10 Cup. We've got to be really proactive in going back to New Zealand and saying this is what we believe the future of the game looks like. These are what are important elements from a provincial union's point of view. And hopefully we get a really good hearing and we get a good outcome for our communities.
Tony, I'll leave you to finish up, mate.
Well, pretty similar to Mike and Kush. Basically, I believe you sit on your ass and wait for something to happen, nothing will. And that's every part of life. So we won't be sitting here waiting for New Zealand rugby or the Crusaders or Australian rugby or world rugby to throw out a silver spoon to us while we're getting off our backsides and trying to make this happen. New Zealand rugby didn't give us a test match because it was nice to take one to the regions. They gave it to us because they're going to make a hell of a lot of money from it. So I think we've got a unique opportunity to work together, and I include New Zealand rugby, the super franchises, the PUs, all the way down to clubs and schools, to really define what the next 10 to 15 years looks like. I think we sometimes look back too much and don't look forward, but we must learn from history, and history clearly tells me that when our three major identities are all working in the same direction, we can achieve anything.
Well, I look forward to the results, guys. The clock's ticking. Cush, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Mike Rogers. Thank you also, Tony. And Simon, also thank you. And Halo Sport for helping present this on the Spinoff. This has been Rugby Unwrapped, the provincial edition. And we'll catch up with you next time. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, Scotty.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Scotty.
Scotty.